Internationally, Germany is seen as a country that has owned up to its violent past. There are memorials to Holocaust victims all over the country. World War II, the Holocaust, and the events directly leading up to them are a mandatory part of the German education system. The Germany of today presents itself as a modern and progressive country that wants to learn from its past, move on from it, and make sure it never happens again. If you were to ask a German about the Holocaust or National Socialism, you'd probably get some variety of the answer that it was one of the worst things humanity has ever done, that they feel shame for their past, and that Germany is attempting to make up for it. Education is a very important thing for people to have, but there is an important difference between understanding something and memorizing facts and how you're supposed to feel about something. Today, Germany's far right is growing more and more powerful, with a virtually non-existent political resistance against it, and the centrist parties of Germany beginning to repeat the same talking points as the far right. It seems that most Germans, or at least not enough of them, have failed to learn the lessons that their own history should have taught them. Following the, as of now, ongoing genocide in Gaza, South Africa has brought a case to the International Court of Justice which calls the Israeli military campaign in the Gaza Strip a genocide. Although many third-world countries have been able to easily identify this, most Western countries haven't yet called it what it is. One such country is Germany, which offered to step in on behalf of Israel in the ICJ case. A statement made by the German government called the accusation of genocide completely baseless, and went on saying, "In view of Germany's history and the crime against humanity of the Holocaust, the government sees itself as particularly committed to the Genocide Convention." In response, the Namibian government openly rejected Germany's decision and said, "Germany cannot morally express commitment to the United Nations Convention against Genocide, including atonement for the genocide in Namibia, while supporting the equivalent of a Holocaust and genocide in Gaza." Most Germans today have relatively little to no idea of the genocide that occurred in Namibia and how this genocide has direct links to the Holocaust. This ignorance is one of the many ways that more deeply entrenched problems in German society have manifested themselves. A quick look through YouTube and Google shows that videos and information about this genocide is not widely available. So in this video, I'm going to explain the Herero and Nama genocide, how Germany still profits from the settlers it implanted there more than 100 years ago, and most importantly, relate important political information from the past to the present. History is the story of humanity, and if you can learn how and why things were done before, you can more easily understand and recognize what is happening now. Before I begin, I apologize that this video maybe isn't as visually engaging as some of my other videos. It's kind of hard to find videos and photos of events that happened over 120 years ago. If you have suggestions for what can be done in the future, I'm open to hearing them. As always, the sources are listed in the description and talked about at the end of the video. What's now known as modern-day Namibia had been a place that was known by Europeans for hundreds of years, but remained unexplored because Europeans thought that it would be a bigger risk with a minimal reward. Namibia was described by a Portuguese writer back in the 1500s as all coast and without people, and because of this, treks into the desert were very rare and usually didn't result in much. To understand how Namibia is set up, we have to take a look at a map. Along its entire western border is a rocky coast, nicknamed the Skeleton Coast because of the sheer number of shipwreck survivors who would end up here and succumb to the heat because they had nowhere to go. Past the coast, however, was the Namib Desert, which also stretches along the entirety of the coast. On Namibia's eastern border lies the Kalahari and the Omahake, two more massive deserts. But in between these deserts, tens of thousands of different African people belonging to different tribes lived in relative comfort, in fields of grass and water, unknowingly protected from colonialism by the deserts that surrounded their land. There were lots of different groups of people living in this place, but the two I'll focus on the most in this video are the Herero and the Nama people. The Herero people migrated to Namibia and Botswana, where the vast majority of them remain today, around the 15th century, where they lived in several close-knit communities where their ancestry could be traced back for several generations. There, their lives are built around their animals, as the majority of the Herero society is pastoralist. From donkeys to dogs, chickens, and especially cows, Taking care of their domestic animals provided Herero people with much of the things they've needed to survive, from jobs to transportation to food and medicine. Clothing is also incredibly important to Herero culture, especially dresses, which are often paired with ochikaiva, a typically flat hat that is coordinated to fit with a dress. While doing research on Herero culture, I came across these quotes from a Namibian activist talking about the importance of the dresses. There are rituals to be followed before any Herero girl wears it for the first time. A cow is slaughtered, the girl has to stay inside the house, and an elder will place the ochikaiva on the girl. That is a celebration that the girl has come of age. There are many myths about the origin of our dress. Some say we copied it from Germans, others say it is from the Victorian times. I have heard that our Herero women started to wear the dress to protect themselves from being raped by the German settlers. It might have also been due to evolution. We have made it our own, regardless of where it originated from. Another really interesting thing I found out was the religion of the Herero, which worships a deity named Njambe. While more and more Herero have converted to Christianity over time, some continue to practice this religion, where in every Herero village, a holy fire named Okuru would be lit, which would serve as a connection between the living and the dead. I read stories about how village elders would sit next to and speak into the fire every morning and every night, and I thought there was something really beautiful in that. And now for the Nama people, they settled in modern-day Namibia after fleeing violence from Dutch settlers in their previous land, modern-day South Africa. The Nama people were a mix of both people and cultures, being mostly made up of either descendants of Croatians, another ethnic group from the Cape, the offspring of Croatians and Dutch settlers, and even some Malaysian slaves that escaped captivity. Many of them, due to their proximity to the Dutch settlers, began to adopt Christianity as well as use guns. Despite this, the Nama people fled the Cape Colony and settled alongside riverbanks in Namibia to set up new towns. Their culture places special importance on storytelling both in narrative and poetic forms, which Nama speak using the Khoekhoegowab language, which uses a clicking sound to form words.
It's a special language which has 4 click sounds. And in once, if I use that all click sounds, I can form a sentence, and it sounds like this. That means let's go to dance.
Now, while the Herero and Nama people did mostly get along with other clans within their same group, they did have territorial disputes with one another that frequently erupted into violence between them. It was with this context in mind that the Germans first came into the picture. Germany actually came into the colonialism game quite late, and most of Africa had already been claimed. At the time, the German Empire had a chancellor by the name of Prince Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was generally opposed to colonialism, not for any moral reasons, but because he thought it would be too expensive, and for the majority of his time as chancellor, he opposed it on these terms. Bismarck was, at least for the time, content on just building up trade relations with other European empires as well as building up their military. However, something else was on the minds of the German public. You see, just to the left of the German Empire, the tiny country of Belgium had just gained independence. And just a few short decades after that, the King of Belgium had colonized the Congo. With one step, Belgium came to control land that was almost 80% larger than Belgium itself. With France and the UK still engaging in colonialism as well, a panic began to break out within the German public. The goal that you were economically healthy and militarily strong wasn't enough for Germans. No, what they wanted, what they believed would make the empire they lived in great, was more living space, a dangerous idea that would continue developing in the following years. Books were published about the topic, the aptly named Does Germany Need Colonies, written by an evangelical theologian, Friedrich Fabry, dealt with exactly that. Fabry claimed in his book that it was a matter of life and death for the development of Germany and put forward the idea that European nations without colonies, despite everything, would always be second-class nations. Groups created to push the idea that Germany needed colonies popped up all around. The German Empire was in a bit of a depression at the time, so when merchants began to push the idea that it would open up new markets and colonial societies pushed the idea that farmers would have more land, the public began to support more colonial policies. Eventually, Bismarck would cave and began supporting the idea of German colonies, partly because he hoped that it would influence the upcoming Reichstag elections. Thankfully for him, there were already Germans on their way to Africa to discuss some land ownership deals. In the 1870s, Adolf Luderitz, a German merchant, had become the owner of his recently deceased father's business. Specializing mostly in tobacco, Luderitz was a mildly successful businessman. He was born, raised, and operated out of Bremen, but everything changed when he became the owner of a trading post in Lagos, which was still under occupation from the British at the time. Now, for a European merchant, trading in Africa was one of the best things you could do for your business. Exaggerating the worth of European goods and undervaluing the African ones increased the company's profit and is a common practice between European traders in Africa. But the problem was, Lagos was still a British colony. A few years after setting up shop there, a new tax law was imposed by the British and Luderitz had to pack up and go home. But he wasn't willing to give up the easy profit he had been making in the last few years and wanted to look for ways to set up his own trading port somewhere in Africa. Along with fellow merchant Heinrich Vogelsang, the two set out to the Namibian coast where they landed on a bay named Angra Pequena. There were two steps that Luderitz and Vogelsang would have to deal with for the land to become properly theirs, by signing a treaty with the African people that lived there and getting all the European powers to recognize the claim. For the Nama that currently lived there, Luderitz and Vogelsang used old-fashioned lying to get the ownership rights they wanted. While meeting with the leaders of the village they were bargaining with, Vogelsang presented the leader with a treaty that would sell 20 geographical miles of coastal land to the Germans in exchange for some goods. Now, a geographical mile is almost 5 times longer than the mile that the Nama were familiar with, and the personal writings between Luderitz and Vogelsang revealed that not only did they know this, but that it was the plan from the beginning to trick the Nama people into giving away most of their land. With one signature, the Nama people of Angra Pequena lost the majority of their land in exchange for 500 pounds and 60 rifles. Now, as for the German Empire itself, they were hesitant to directly become involved with this project in the beginning. Unsure if the British had any rights to the land around the Namibian coast, raising the German flag right away could have caused some conflicts. But von Bismarck had an idea. The British Empire was set up as various colonies around the world, but they also had these protectorates that were technically separate states, but under the protection of the British Empire. Coinciding with the upcoming elections, Bismarck made the decision that the land purchased by Luderitz would be under the protection of the German Empire. Now with the settlement set up, which he named Luderitz after himself, begrudgingly recognized by the Nama that lived there as well as the German Empire, Adolf thought that he could sit back and make easy money. Except that's not exactly what happened. He commissioned a few more expeditions around his settlements, bought more and more land, and hired groups of miners to look for minerals such as gold and diamonds. All of this cost him more money than he had, and eventually von Bismarck would create the German Southwest African Colonial Company to buy out all of Luderitz from him. Now with more money, Adolf would plan to finally go on an expedition down a river himself, where he ended up drowning to death. With Luderitz dead and gone, and the German Empire now owning a coastal town, von Bismarck would appoint an imperial commissioner to manage the settlement, a Dr. Heinrich Göring. Right away, Göring with a small group of officers set out to make protection treaties with neighboring tribes to legitimize their presence in Namibia even further. They approached a Herero tribe that had recently been involved in a war with a clan of Nama named the Witboi, inadvertently making themselves and the German Empire enemies of this clan. Unfortunately for Göring, the Witboi, led by Captain Hendrik Witboi, was among the most powerful of the Nama clans in Namibia. Now, Hendrik Witboi was a very interesting person. Like most Nama, he was a devout Christian, he was fluent in Khoekhoegowab and Dutch, and most importantly, he was aware and resisted what Europeans were doing across the African continent. Göring and his team sent out request after request to meet with the Witboi, and they were all ignored, except one, where Hendrik finally replied, "I gather that you want to negotiate peace, you who call yourself a representative. How shall I respond? You are someone else's representative, and I am a free and autonomous man answering to none but God. So I have nothing further to say to you. A representative has less power than an autonomous man. I see no need to follow your summons at this point." Despite this, the Germans tried to sign more protection treaties with other Nama clans, but very few were receptive to his offer. To make matters worse, prospectors from Germany had begun arriving looking for gold to mine. So now we have essentially a bunch of German colonial officers and an empty colony where the safety of the German settlers can't be guaranteed, a bunch of prospectors with nothing to do but drink, and a war between two neighboring clans happening. All of this culminated in the Herero people terminating the peace treaty with the Germans and Göring fleeing back to Germany. There were a couple of reasons for this, namely the fact that 1. The protection treaty was pretty useless for the Herero since they were currently at war and Germany was not doing any protecting. 2. The prospectors who had come to mine for gold were violent and sexually abusive towards the Hereros, which of course went completely unpunished. And 3. That Göring himself made the decision to build something over an ancient Herero gravesite. Back in Berlin, Göring was transferred to be the ambassador to Haiti, and the Reichstag needed to regroup. This time, instead of sending a former lawyer, they would send a military officer. Kurt von Francois, a Luxembourgish veteran of the Franco-Prussian War that had ended 20 years prior, arrived in Namibia with a small group of imperial soldiers. There was a reason the German Empire had chosen von Francois to send to Namibia because he already had experience in Africa. Kurt von Francois served as a mercenary in King Leopold's Congo Free State, where he eventually became a slave trader and shaped his views about how Africans should be dealt with. In private, he would write, "The Europeans have failed to give the black man the right kind of treatment. They have made too many concessions, granting all the black man's wishes without bearing in mind that this is only interpreted as a sign of weakness." When von Bismarck sent von Francois to Namibia, it was under the explicit orders that they were not to use force and that they should re-establish legal ties with the Herero and the Nama. So what did von Francois do? He and his soldiers built a fort, named Kaiser Wilhelm Fort, in the middle of a popular trading route used by virtually everyone that lived in the area. From this fort, von Francois and his soldiers would rob basically anyone who passed by it: Herero, Nama, English traders, even other Germans. Obviously, this pissed a lot of people off, including von Bismarck, but it forced him to send von Francois more soldiers to defend themselves against attacks from outside, which is exactly what Francois wanted. All of this was still happening while the Herero and Witbooi Nama were still at war with one another, and unwilling to fight two wars at once, the chief of the Hereros, Chief Chamwaha, decided to sign another protection treaty with the Germans. But just a few short months after the treaty was signed, Chamwaha would die, and the Herero people would be preoccupied trying to figure out who would be the next leader. Von Francois used this instability to move his troops out of Fort Wilhelm and into Windhoek, a valley that lay on the border of Herero land and the land of the Witbooi. In Windhoek, von Francois and his men would construct a bigger fort than Fort Wilhelm, and with the presence of the Imperial Army there, German settlers slowly felt safe enough to start moving into Windhoek. Now, while the Herero were preoccupied with who would be the next chief, which eventually ended up being Samuel Maherero, Chamwaha's son, Hendrik Witboi's concerns began to shift. Hendrik was well aware of what Europeans did when they landed in Africa. He had newspapers delivered to him from the Cape, read about world news, and learned about the Berlin Conference. As the settlement in Windhoek began to grow and grow, the Witbooi abandoned their fight with the Herero and attempted to make peace with them. Von Francois would try repeatedly to sign a protection treaty with Hendrik Witbooi, but was rejected at every turn. Reading the newspapers and understanding the way that Europeans operated within Africa allowed him to see these so-called protection treaties for what they are, a form of control over the African tribes. He rejected von Francois' offer by asking him, "What are we being protected against?" They both knew. A little while later, the Witbooi and the Herero agreed on peace terms. For von Francois, this was the end of negotiations. Over the next few months, over 250 soldiers would be sent to Windhoek as reinforcements. On the 12th of April 1893, Kurt von Francois and 200 of his men would approach Hoornkrans, a Witbooi encampment in the mountains where Hendrik and his family were staying. Von Francois and his men loaded their rifles, aimed into the encampment, and began to fire indiscriminately. In the 30 minutes that the massacre happened, 16,000 rounds had been fired. Hendrik awoke and ordered the men to grab their rifles and run towards one side of the encampment, hoping that the Germans would follow behind and leave the rest of the people alone. Instead, the Germans took out their bayonets and began to butcher the children, the women, and the elderly. Among the children killed, Hendrik's 12-year-old son was murdered by a German soldier with a gunshot to the head. One of the Witboi fighters describes the scene. I and 2 other men got on a small kopje and saw some women sitting a distance away. We called to them to get away, but they remained until the Germans passed. One of the soldiers shot one of these women. The others begged for their lives and asked for the Germans to make slaves of them rather than kill them. The German soldiers took the women away, driving them before them. One woman was killed while a child clung to her screaming. A soldier shot the child through the head, blowing it to pieces. I saw the child shot. The soldier aimed at it. Horses were set on fire and burnt over the bodies of dead women and children. On other side of the Werft, all the women were killed except 2 of whom one was wounded. I did not count them. The bodies were decomposing when I went there. Many children were killed in the houses. A German soldier who participated in the massacre would also describe these events in his diary. On all sides, terrible scenes were disclosed to us. Under and over the hanging rocks lay the corpses of 7 Witboi who, in their death agony, had crawled into the hollow, and their bodies lay pressed tightly together. In another place, the body of a woman obstructed the footpath. While 2 3 to 4-year-old children sat quietly playing beside their mother's corpse, it was a fearful sight. Burning huts, human bodies, and the remains of animals, scattered furniture, destroyed, and useless rifles, that was the picture that presented itself to the eyes. Throughout the massacre, only 1 German soldier had died. Now, this massacre and how it happened was nothing new. Europe had been doing things exactly like this throughout Africa, the Americas, Asia, anywhere they wanted to conquer. But back in Europe, colonization was portrayed as a very noble thing to do. Not much thought was given to what happened to the people that lived there before Europeans began to settle. To many of the people back in Europe that weren't in the military, the idea that Europeans had come in and massacred anyone who was in the way was unthinkable, and everyone had different ideas about why anytime Europeans left Europe, everyone they encountered just ended up dying. Theologians thought that it was because the entire world was destined for the white races of the world, and that all the people living there currently were just placeholders that took care of the land until the whites were ready to take it over, and then the rest of the population would just fade away. However, in the 1800s, a popular book had been published that seemed to provide a scientific answer to why certain races would die off. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Now, this book put forward the theory that life develops through a process of natural selection. The species and animals that are better adapted to survive will continue living and reproducing, and the species and animals that couldn't would die off and not pass off any of their traits. Some people really liked this theory. In fact, they liked it so much that they would apply it also to races and use natural selection to justify killing off entire groups of people. So whenever a group of Europeans had settled somewhere, be it in Africa, Australia, wherever, and the indigenous population has completely died off, people came to understand that this was because they were weak, that they couldn't adapt to the future, and that their death was a symbol that humanity was progressing towards a more powerful race. Other theories and terms would be born out of this worldview, the most damaging of which was called Rassenreinheit, or racial hygiene, which would seek to preserve the purity of a race by intentionally avoiding race mixing with impure races. Germany and its growing field of race scientists were big supporters of this theory, and many respected scientists began to use this theory in their writings. Another German political theorist by the name of Friedrich Ratzel began to develop his own theory out of this idea, Lebensraum, or living space. Unlike his contemporaries, though, he felt no need to hide or obscure what Europeans did when they came to a new land. An open advocate for colonialism and the founder of the German Colonial Society, Ratzel argued that the true purpose of colonization wasn't just extracting resources, but that people should take the land and make it their own, and that this was exactly how races ensured their survival. As for the people that lived there, he had no problem admitting that they were simply exterminated by a superior race, citing the United States as one of his influences. Although the word didn't exist for it yet, he was advocating for genocide. Despite the perceived impurity of black people, the German public itself was fascinated by them. Stories about the American frontier, heroic cowboys, and civilizing missions undertaken by colonial soldiers created quite a big interest in these exotic cultures. There was actually a very large human zoo located in Treptow-Park in the 1890s. In one summer alone, 7.5 million people came to this zoo to see different people from around the world, people described as pieces of natural savagery. Enclosures were set up for different people from different parts of the world, and the people that were jailed in these zoos were made to dress up in what Germans thought was their natural clothing and perform rituals that they thought were part of their culture. There's actually quite a funny anecdote in the book The Kaiser's Genocide about when Germans wanted to display some Herero and Nama people in these zoos and how the interactions went down. Like I said, the Herero people were quite accustomed to nice clothes and dresses, and the Nama were the amalgamation of a lot of different cultures and experiences, and they tended to wear European military uniforms. So when they arrived in Berlin, not knowing that they were going to be shown off to people who had paid to come and watch savages perform their rituals, they were told that they needed to dress up in more traditional clothing, which they obviously refused to do. On top of this, they refused to perform any of the rituals they were asked to reenact and behave normally. The Nama people sat around and discussed the Bible, and the Herero people, some of which had even learned German, began to have normal conversations with the people in the crowd. I think worst of all was Friedrich Maherero, the chief's son, who began to flirt with the women in the crowd, and apparently some of the women were so enamored with him that they wrote him love letters even years later. Now, the race scientists who had created this entire zoo to show how savage the lower races were obviously saw all of this. But instead of thinking that maybe their theories were wrong, they just ignored it. And yet, now that the superior white race had landed in Namibia, people didn't just disappear. It didn't make sense to them. Even worse than that, they were resisting. After the massacre, Hendrik and the surviving fighters gathered more support from other Nama clans and began to attack and conduct raids on von Francois' army. They would steal their food, their horses, their weapons, isolating them and attacking them wherever they could. Hendrik sent one of his other sons, Klein Hendrik, to meet with a British officer stationed in a nearby bay to alert him of the massacre they had suffered. The officer replied, "I cannot understand how there could have been a killing of women and children such as you tell me of. European nations do not make war in that way." Despite this response, the officer sent a report detailing the massacre back to Britain, and it ended up in some British newspapers, with some papers claiming it to be a massacre of innocents and others claiming it to be a heroic victory against savages, not to mention the hostilities of the Witboi against all German military presence. Kurt von Francois was dismissed from his post and sent back to Germany. Now, before I continue on with the history of German colonialism in Namibia, I want to first talk about the development of some dangerous racial ideologies that so strongly motivated the German Empire to do what I'm about to tell you, how both settlers and soldiers saw Namibians and other non-white races, and how this ideology is closely linked to the idea of empires and culture. We already talked about the idea of racial hygiene, which was further expanded on after the Herero and Nama genocide, but during the 19th century there was another ideology called the Völkisch movement that was a sort of half-spiritual, half-racial idea that the German race could only truly be German if people of German descent had German land that they could farm and work over. The ideology glorified a farming lifestyle, essentially one where a person was connected to the earth that they lived on. In the early 19th century, this wasn't a huge problem, there was still lots of farmland, but as the century progressed, Germany began to industrialize, and with industrialization came landlords who slowly but surely acquired more and more of the land. Now this German way of life, this spiritual connection to your country, what made a German German, was lost for millions of people. Even worse than this, the farmers who had lost their land had either two places to go. They would either immigrate out of Germany or into a German city, and both were problematic for different reasons. For those that moved out of Germany, say to either North or South America, or even somewhere else in Europe, they would arrive and start a new life, and essentially stop being German. Since Germany had no colonies, whenever a German left, that was a loss for the empire. And for those that moved to the urban parts of Germany, there was simply nowhere for them to live. In a few years, thousands and thousands of people began to move to cities, and they had nowhere to stay. There were no jobs, there was no food, housing could not be built quick enough. And political parties that believed in this folkish movement saw only one solution: that the stream of German migrants with nowhere to go be redirected to German colonies in Africa, where even though it wouldn't be German soil, it could at least serve to preserve their Germanness. This idea, at least specifically in this form, isn't around as much anymore, at least as far as I can tell, but I want to invite you to imagine that this isn't a history video and that you are actually living back in the 1890s in the German Empire. People are leaving your country in droves because there's nowhere to live. People whose jobs and whose land have been privatized simply aren't needed anymore to work the land. Instead of thinking about why they don't have anywhere to live and why they don't have a job, these politicians' main priority is that they maintain their racial and cultural characteristics. Instead of accepting that sometimes groups of people move around the world, that their culture changes, and that, in turn, the culture of where they've moved to changes because of them as well, the idea that a German would be less German moved such a big part of the ruling class of the German Empire that they would colonize a country. Obviously, this wasn't the only reason, that's not what I'm saying, but it is a big part of it. Instead of letting a culture change, the necessity to conserve it is what justified the violence that is about to come. And culture changing is also not a bad thing. And I think we have a perfect example of that with the Nama people, a group who are literally the amalgamation of so many different groups and ideas that all live on through the Nama people that are still around today. I want to point this out to you so that you can draw parallels to your own life and your own country. What are people willing to do today? Who are they willing to hurt? That can be justified by this need to preserve some idealized idea of culture. Back in Namibia, however, since the man the German Empire had sent to make the colony safe for settlers had done virtually everything he could to do the exact opposite, he was replaced by Theodor Leutwein. The son of a priest, a former law student, and a veteran of the army, Leutwein opted to use a mixture of force and diplomacy to make Namibia safe for more settlers, and he started by targeting all the clans who hadn't signed protection treaties under Göring or von Francois. A prime example of how he did this was in the case of Andreas Lambert, a Nama chief of a tribe who was involved in the killing of a German traitor. Leutwein and his army approached Lambert and arrested him, agreeing to release him only on the condition that he acknowledged German sovereignty. Lambert agreed, was released, and tried to organize some sort of military resistance. Still too powerful, Leutwein came in again, arrested him, and executed him. They took some of the clan's land as punishment, their weapons, and made Lambert's brother the next ruler, only after he agreed to sign the treaty that Leutwein had wanted Lambert to sign in the first place. This continued until Leutwein had every single Nama clan sign a treaty, either of their free will or at gunpoint, except for the Witboi, who up until then had never accepted Germany's presence in Namibia. As for the Herero, Leutwein warmed up to them by settling a succession dispute. Samuel Maherero had taken over for his father after his death, but this was something that some other Hereros had disputed and refused to recognize. In response, Samuel went to the Germans to ask for assistance in having his claim to power legitimized. Because of this, Leutwein was able to mediate between Samuel and the other Herero parties, and the dispute was resolved. This one act, along with the fact that Leutwein was a completely different person and not Göring or von Francois, which were pretty hated at the time, warmed up the Herero people to the presence of the Germans. With virtually every single other tribe pacified and under a protection treaty, Leutwein again turned his attention to the Witboi. He approached them, claiming that every other tribe in the area had a protection treaty with Germany, and that the Witbois are standing in the way of peace. This was, of course, ignored by the Witboi, and eventually Germany just decided to attack. In the weeks leading up to the attack, Leutwein wrote Hendrik Witboi quite frequently, and I wanted to read this one conversation the two shared before they would go to war. Leutwein would write, "Should I succeed in killing you and all your men, the war would be at an end. But should you succeed in killing me and all my men, the war would by no means be at an end, for the Empire of Germany would, from his vast army, Send double or treble the numbers of men, and many more field guns, and you would have to start over. His Majesty the German Emperor has sent with specific orders to carry on the war to your destruction, unless you surrender. I do not know you and have no personal enmity against you at all, but shall of course carry out my orders and fight you to the death." Hendrik responded, "I have never met the Emperor, and therefore cannot have offended him by word or by deed. God has given us different realms on earth, and through that I know and believe that it is neither sin nor crime for me to want to remain the independent chief of my country and people. If you want to kill me for without any fault of mine, there is no harm done, nor is it a disgrace. I shall die honestly for that which is my own." Luitwijn would soon go to battle with the Witbooi, forcing Hendrik to come to terms that he couldn't resist much longer and finally that he'd have to surrender. Luitwijn presented him a protection treaty that he'd have to sign that was meant to seem as nice as possible while still sneaking in some stipulations that worked massively in their favor. For example, the Witbooi were able to keep their land, their weapons, and weren't punished at all. But in exchange for this, a stipulation was added that Witbooi Namas could be conscripted into the German colonial army should they ever need it. Now, with the Witbois out of the way and not a threat to German settlers, more of them started moving in. Around 1894, when the treaty was signed, there were around 1,000 Germans living in settler communities. Under Luitwijn, the German colony was following a policy of integrating Africans into the German economic structure. Luitwijn, like many colonial theorists, understood that it would be more profitable if they were to use the Herero and Nama as an economic resource rather than simply slaughtering and displacing them all. This is why he tried to influence both the settlers and his soldiers to be peaceful with Africans already living there. Because of this, Luitwijn was not a popular or well-liked leader, not in Windhoek, the most populated urban center in German Southwest Africa, or in the Reichstag, as both groups thought he was being too lenient. Despite this, the two communities continued to live side by side with relative peace for the next decade, when suddenly, out of nowhere, the Herero decided to stage a bloody massacre of innocent German settlers for no reason at all. Or at least, that's how the German media like to portray it. No, in reality, there were two lies being told simultaneously, that they lived side by side in relative peace, and that this was a bloody massacre of poor, innocent German settlers. In the years approaching the attack by the Herero, a few key things had changed the structure of the German colony. First, a disease had infiltrated the cattle of the Herero tribe and had killed off virtually all of them. The Herero, who for years had treated cattle as currency and as a sign of wealth, and had now lost much of their land to Germans, were now starving. Poor, they came to German settlements looking for work. This was both problematic and good, for Luitwijn at least, for a few reasons. With Herero now working in German settlements, they got their first taste of what it was like to live using the labor provided by the Herero communities. Problematic, however, was the close proximity of German settlers and Hereros. It's easy to feign peace and tolerance when the Herero lived in their land and the Germans lived in their own, where the settlers would virtually never interact with the Herero unless they were servants, laborers, or prisoners of war, but to see proud people with their own culture and language in their town rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. In the years leading up to 1904, the rate of settler on African violence, especially sexual violence, rose every year. Herero workers that were employed by German settlers were repeatedly whipped for things as small as refusing to answer a question. The court system themselves also clearly had a racial bias. Settlers were almost never convicted for violence against Hereros, and of the few that were, they were given very light sentences. A prime example of this was in the case of a German baker who had dragged a Herero chief out of his store for being disrespectful and whipped him until he bled. For this, the baker was made to pay 20 marks. Another case was that of a German settler named Dietrich, who hitched a ride to another town with a Herero chief. In the night, Dietrich murdered the chief's pregnant wife after she resisted his attempts to rape her. For this, Dietrich wasn't punished. The Hereros became so mad that Luitwijn had to step in personally and brought the case to court again, where Dietrich was convicted to 3 years of prison. He was released early and became an officer of the Schutztruppe, the official name of the colonial army. On top of virtually always taking the side of the German settlers, the court even punished women who reported rapes by whipping or jailing them for bearing false testimony. At this point in time, it was very clear to the Herero that Germans could just freely kill and beat them whenever they wanted to, and that the colonial government would do nothing about it. All of this boiled over to the events of January 12, 1904, in the town of Okahanja. A trader who had arrived a few days ago had reported that he saw a large group of armed Herero men heading towards the town. Assuming the worst, the officer in charge of the town, Lieutenant Zern, ordered that all whites evacuate and bunkered up in a fortress. 2 men were sent to go check out the local Herero settlement, and upon discovering 100 men there, rushed back to tell Zern, who immediately turned around and reported that the Herero had begun to attack settlers. Eventually, the 2 groups began to shoot at each other, killing a few and destroying lots of property. However, the Herero men weren't there to start fighting with the settlers of Okahanja. No, these men were sent as messengers to Samuel Maherero, asking for help dealing with an inheritance dispute, who just happened to stop in the town out of sheer bad luck. Zern himself was particularly hated by the Herero, as what he did is a perfect example of the attitudes German colonial officers had towards the native populations. Before this event, Zern had forged land treaties with the Hereros and used the documents that he signed himself as an excuse to take their land. On top of this, he would then go to their ancestral burial grounds that he had just stolen from them, exhumed the bodies of their ancestors, and shipped off parts of them back to Germany to be studied by race scientists. At this point, the Herero had had enough of over a decade of violence and abuses at the hands of German settlers, and after being massacred at Okahanja for literally no reason other than the fear the settlers had themselves, they decided to respond with an attack. In the following days, a wave of violence exploded across the German settlements. Herero servants turned on their employers and killed them, some while they were still asleep. Groups were formed to hunt down rapists and thieves who had escaped justice from a racist court system, and they were killed too. Cattle that had been stolen were stolen back. Now, unlike the Germans, the Herero actually had some rules of engagement that they stuck to. For example, Samuel Maherero made it clear that it was only German men who were the targets of the attack. No women or children were to be harmed. On top of this, Maherero claimed that this was not a war against them because they were white, but because they were German. And because of this, Herero soldiers left Boers and the English who were around unharmed. And by all accounts, the vast majority of Herero followed this order. There was even an account of a Herero soldier who came to a farmhouse to beat the farmer to death and discovered that the man's wife had fled and abandoned her child. The soldiers took the child and delivered her to the German authorities. So, did the media back in Germany report what was actually happening and what had led up to the events? No, of course not. Immediately, reports had come out that the African savages had attacked settler communities for no reason, that they had tortured men and that they had raped women. German artists began to create art corroborating this event, showing groups of Hereros holding down a German woman in a white dress. A passage reads, "As the artist had no knowledge of life in Southwest Africa, he depicted the Herero wearing the overalls and hats common among black sharecroppers in the deep south of the United States." Germany had good records of the deaths and was in direct contact with Luitven throughout much of the massacres via telegrams. Contradictory reports were published, with entire families reported in newspapers as dead, only for a few days later to discover that they were actually alive and well. When Luitven reported that a few women had been ill-treated, he was immediately asked whether the ill-treatment of white women meant rape. He responded, "Probably it means rape." Despite having records of the dead, the colony kept sending massively inflated death tolls to make the civilian casualties and how they died seem worse than they actually were, and the German press never once stopped to question the validity of what they were writing. And honestly, why would they? In their minds, the Herero were savages. They were less than human. Why would they even consider investigating why the Herero had attacked in the first place? To the Germans, it was part of their nature, their culture, their religion, and of course, when they attacked, it was for absolutely no reason at all. So how true was the claim that the Herero came in massacring white people at random and slaughtering whole families? Well, as it turns out, not true at all. By the end of the war, after all the bodies were counted, only 4 women and 1 child had been killed. Earlier I asked you to imagine and draw parallels to your own lives and countries about political figures that use the ideas of cultures that couldn't change to justify violence. Now, I want you to watch this video.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Naira, and I just came out of Kuwait. My mother and I were in Kuwait on August 2nd for a peaceful summer holiday. My older sister had a baby on July 29th, and we wanted to spend some time in Kuwait with her. The second week after an invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying. I could not help but think of my nephew, who, if born premature, might have died that day as well.
Powerful stuff, isn't it? Except none of it was true. This is the Naira testimony, the testimony of a young girl given in the United States who allegedly saw all of the acts she mentioned, except both she and the people that organized her testimony, an American public relations firm, knew that it was completely fake. Despite this, the testimony was broadcasted on over 100 different channels, and over 50 million Americans saw it. President George Bush repeated this story 10 times in the following weeks, drumming up support for an invasion and really emphasizing that these people that they were going to be fighting were savages who killed babies. And it worked. A year later, the United States invaded Iraq. The Naira testimony and the stories and illustrations of massacres committed against German settlers are forms of atrocity propaganda. Stories so horrifying they influence you to support one side over another because, well, the other side is made up of savages. They do things that no human could ever do. It isn't surprising, but it is always saddening to see how little humans have progressed in 100 years and how often the same story keeps repeating itself. And yet, this atrocity propaganda has repeated itself again recently following the October 7th attacks.
An die Hamas und ihre Verbündeten. Lassen Sie diese unschuldigen Menschen, lassen Sie diese unschuldigen kleinen Mädchen frei.
I never really thought that I would see and have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children. I never thought I'd ever. Anyway,
A family of 4, a young boy and girl, 6 and 8 years old, and their parents around the breakfast table. The father, his eye gouged out in front of his kids. The mother's breast cut off. The girl's foot amputated. The boy's fingers cut off before they were executed. And then their executioners sat down and had a meal.
Dann wurde mir parallel der Film gezeigt dessen, was nicht ich oder die israelische Regierung aufgenommen hat, sondern Hamas-Kämpfer mit ihren, wie heißen die, GoPro-Kameras an ihren Helmen. Und wissen Sie, was ich da gesehen habe? Das war das Schlimmste, was man sich vorstellen kann. Ich habe es mir angeschaut, weil ich wissen wollte, was dort passiert ist. Und zu erleben, wie eine Frau vor laufender Kamera vergewaltigt wird. Wollen Sie immer noch bei vergewaltigten Frauen dazwischen schreien?
On October 7, Hamas, a terrorist organization, slaughtered 1,200 Israelis. Many of them young people who were simply attending a concert. Women were horribly raped. And so absolutely, I said then, I say now, Israel has a right to defend itself. We would.
Immediately, stories were repeated in the United States, in Germany, and across the Western world of the barbarity of the attacks. Except as time went on, more and more of the stories ended up being revealed as completely untrue. Biden directly said he saw videos of babies being burned alive in ovens, a complete lie that everyone, including him, knew was made up. Every day, more and more of the details became clearer, and yet, political leaders keep repeating the same lies. the most egregious and published of the lies being, of course, the claims of systemic sexual assault. Testimonies published by popular news sites making claims of sexual torture are spread around with little attention given to the fact that the source changed his story not once, but twice before even mentioning sexual assault, and all while being a former IDF soldier himself. News reports with titles claiming testimony after testimony of rape are being collected and published, while within the article mentioning no physical evidence, no identified victims, and that, quote, the commission has not taken testimony directly, meaning they haven't spoken to anyone claiming it happened to them, are used as credible evidence. In one of the videos that was previously shown, the Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany, Annalena Baerbock, claims that she personally saw videos of women being raped, despite neither the UN or Israel themselves having knowledge about this video. A journalist asks at a press conference how it's possible that the Foreign Affairs Minister of Germany has watched a body cam video that neither the UN or Israel know about, to which the representative responded,
Ich muss sagen, ich bin ehrlich gesagt einigermaßen schockiert, weil das habe ich ja dem Kollegen Warwick auch am Mittwoch schon gesagt, ich finde, Ihre Frage insinuiert, dass es diese sexualisierte Gewalt und diese Vergewaltigung nicht gegeben hat am 7. Oktober.
On top of this, the claim that Hamas fighters intentionally targeted civilians have also been thrown into question recently, as Israelis themselves are reporting that they were not hurt and their friends weren't killed by Hamas but the Israeli military. Freed Israeli hostage Noah Argamani has come out clearly stating, they didn't beat me and didn't cut my hair. I was in a building that was blown up by the Israeli Air Force. I emphasize that they didn't hit me, but I was hurt all over my body from the collapse of the structure on me. As a victim of October 7th, I will not allow myself to be a victim again by the media. Another October 7th survivor claims that civilians were killed by the IDF themselves.
מצטרפים ל8 האלה ואנחנו הולכים להיות בערך כ-12 בני ערובה עם 40 מחבלים ששומרים עלינו. אני מקצרת לך את הסיפור כי
הם מתעללים בכם?
הם לא מתעללים בנו, הם מתנהגים אלינו בצורה מאוד אנושית, זה אומר שהם שומרים עלינו. כן, מה זה אומר אנושית? שומרים עלינו, הם נותנים לנו לשתות פה ושם, שהם רואים שאנחנו בלחץ, הם מרגיעים אותנו. הייתה תחושה מאוד מאוד מפחידה, אבל אף אחד לא התנהג אלינו באלימות. למזלי, לא קרה לי מה שאני שומעת. אנחנו אלה שהתקשרנו במשטרה יחד עם החוטפים, כי החוטפים רצו שהמשטרה תגיע, כי המטרה שלהם הייתה לחטוף אותנו לעזה, לא לרצוח אותנו. ואחרי שעתיים שאנחנו נמצאים שם עם החוטפים, מגיעה המשטרה, מתנהל קרב ירי שהמשטרה שלנו מתחילה אותו, ועל הדשא של בגינה של האנשים מהקיבוץ, שיש 5 בני ערובה ששוכבים או 6 על האדמה בחוץ, ממש כצאן לטבח מול הירי של הימ"מ שלנו והמחבלים.
הטרוריסטים ירו בהם?
לא, הם נהרגו מהחילופי ירי, תבין שהיה חילופי ירי מאוד מאוד קשים.
זאת אומרת, יכול להיות שזה כוחותינו ירו בהם? כשניסו לפסל את החוטפים, את החמאס? כן, חיסלו את כולם,
כולל הבני ערובה, כי היה שם חילופי ירי מאוד מאוד קשים.
Actually, let's talk about one of the things this person said. Their objective was to kidnap us into Gaza, not to kill us. One thing that has been completely absent from the reporting of October 7th was what Hamas was trying to do in the first place, which was to kidnap hostages from Israel and hold them for ransom in exchange for some of the thousands of Palestinians held hostage by Israel in administrative detention. To report honestly might humanize the enemy too much, so just like with the Herero uprising, why they decided to attack was completely ignored, and then it creates a feedback loop that can justify anything. Time and time and time again, imperialists use these same strategies to make the public support the ensuing war crimes because, frankly, the citizens of their country make it easy. All they really have to do is play into the already present racism in their country, with Germany of 1900s playing into the belief of the savagery of Africans, and Germany, the USA, and Israel of today playing into already present racist ideas about the Arab world and Islam. And if you personally want to criticize Hamas and Palestinian resistance, fine, but at least have those criticisms be based in actual reality. If you would like to learn more about the Gaza genocide and the surrounding history, I suggest one of my older videos talking about exactly this topic, and if you want to learn more about specifically the October 7th attack and go in depth about the planning and execution of it, I highly, highly recommend this video, which is an analysis made by an Israeli. The irony isn't lost on me either that both the Israeli Defense Force and the German Schutztruppe, which also translates to Defense Force, have essentially the same name, despite both of them being foreign occupying forces actively engaging in colonialism. And if after everything you still believe, oh, but this time they are actually savages, then congratulations, you are the exact same idiots that openly cheered for genocide of the subhumans back in 1904. And now I want to bring everything back to the Hereros. Some might be asking, just like they did about the Palestinian resistance, well, what did they expect was going to happen? They had to have known that the Germans or the Israelis would fight back. And the thing is, well, for one, nothing justifies a genocide, but two, Samuel Maherero almost certainly knew that he was going to die soon. Shortly before the attack, he sent a letter to Hendrik Witbooi pleading with him to join his resistance, and I think that parts of this letter can also be analogous for the situation in Gaza. All of our obedience and patience with the Germans is of little avail. For each day they shoot someone dead for no reason at all. Hence, I appeal to you, my brother, not to hold aloof from the uprising, but to make your voice heard so that all Africa may take up arms against the Germans. Let us die fighting rather than die as a result of maltreatment, imprisonment, or some other calamity. This letter would never make it to the Witbooi. When you come before the enemy, let him be struck down. There will be no mercy. Prisoners will not be taken. Just as the Huns 1,000 years ago made a name for themselves in which their greatness still resounds, so let the name of Germany be known in China in such a way that a Chinese will never dare even to look askance at a German. These were the words Kaiser Wilhelm II said to his troops as they were preparing to march into China to fight against the Boxer Rebellion. Among those troops was General Adrian Dietrich Lothar von Trotha. Once he had gotten his fill burning down villages in China, the Kaiser sent him to German Southwest Africa to be the commander of the military force there. Upon arriving, von Trotha declared martial law, effectively taking away all power from under Luitwein and becoming the sole leader over the entire colony. The Herero had gathered at Waterberg, a plateau with religious significance. Around 60,000 men, women, and children had come together in a holy place to await the German response. They had expected, now that they had proven their ability and willingness to fight back, that the Germans would be willing to enter peace talks with them. Instead of peace, however, von Trotha had spent the following 3 months transporting as many troops and as much equipment as possible around the Waterberg. When everything was ready, von Trotha began his own trek to his camp near the plateau. His journey to the camp, as well as some other stories that occurred in the following months, was described by his interpreter and Horst's caretaker, who would later give this testimony. When leaving Okahanja, General von Trotha issued orders to his troops that no quarter was to be given to the enemy. No prisoners were to be taken, but all, regardless of age or sex, were to be killed. General von Trotha said, "We must exterminate them, so that we won't be bothered with rebellions in the future." As a result of this order, the soldiers shot all natives we came across. It did not matter who they were. Some were peaceful people who had not gone into rebellion, others, such as old men and old women, had never left their homes. Yet these were all shot. I often saw this done. Once, while on the march near Hamakari beyond the Waterberg, we came to some water holes. It was wintertime and very cold. We came on 2 very old Herero women. They made a small fire and were warming themselves. They had dropped back from the main body of Hereros owing to exhaustion. Von Trotha and his staff were present. A German soldier dismounted, walked up to the old woman, and shot them both as they lay there. The next day we moved off again and came across another woman of about 30. She was also busy digging for wild onions and took no notice of us. A soldier named Schilling walked up behind her and shot her through the back. I was an eyewitness to everything I have related. In addition, I saw the bleeding bodies of hundreds of men, women, and children, old and young, lying around the roads as we passed. They had all been killed by our advanced guards. I was for nearly 2 years with the German troops and always with General von Trotha. I know of no instance in which prisoners were spared. After von Trotha and the German army had completed their journey to the Waterberg, leaving many bodies behind them, they began to plan their attack on the Herero settlement. In his own words, "My initial plan for the operation, which I always adhered to, was to encircle the masses of Hereros at Waterberg and to annihilate these masses with a simultaneous blow. Then to establish various stations to hunt down and disarm the splinter groups who escaped, later to lay hands on the captains by putting prize money on their heads, and finally to sentence them to death." His army would be broken up into 6 troops, with one of them, the one guarding the southeastern border of the Waterberg, weaker than the rest. On the 11th of August 1904, at exactly 6 a.m., the Germans would start their massacre. Most of the Herero were still asleep when the first bombs exploded over their tents. The Germans continued massacring every man, woman, and child without ever stopping until 3 p.m. After 9 hours of non-stop shooting and explosions, the Herero finally managed to find somewhere to escape, the southeastern border. To this day, it is still debated about whether von Trotha had intentionally left this part of the border weaker than the rest, letting the Herero break through or not, but regardless, the situation for the Herero had inadvertently gone from bad to worse. With the Herero now being able to escape, they ran as fast as they could through the hole in their encirclement and into the Omahake Desert. After killing everyone who couldn't escape, the Germans took a break for a day before heading into the desert, looking to kill whoever they could find. While walking into the desert, the personal belongings dumped by people fleeing for their lives littered the sands. It wouldn't take long for them to find out what had happened to the people. A soldier who took part in these trips into the desert would write in his notes, "The greater part of the Herero nation and their cattle lay dead in the bush, lining the path of their morbid march. Everyone among us realized what had happened here. Whenever we dismounted, our feet would hit against the human bodies. There was a young woman with wilted breasts, her frozen face covered with flies and curled up next to her hip, an aborted birth. There was a boy. He was still alive, staring into the night with a stupid grin from an empty mind. Whoever took part in this chase through the Sandfeld lost his belief in righteousness on earth." Frustrated with the small number of people his troops would kill with every trip, von Trotha instead ordered his soldiers to set up around waterholes in the desert and to form a perimeter, effectively preventing any Hereros from finding water or being able to escape. Shortly after, he issued his Vernichtigungsbefehl, or extermination order. Within the German borders, every Herero, with or without gun, with or without cattle, will be shot. I will no longer accept women and children. I will drive them back to their people, or I will let them be shot at. These are my words to the Herero people, signed the great general of the mighty Kaiser, von Trotha. The following year would be marked by numerous massacres of Herero across the entire country, and it's important to emphasize that this was not a campaign undertaken secretly by the German colonial forces, and that the settlers were well aware of what was happening around them. One account written by a visiting missionary details that women of the settlements would gather around and watch as Hereros were hung, and that they would spit and insult them as they died. Although many of the Herero tribes and people had come together during the revolt by Samuel Maherero, there were also many Herero tribes who lived in isolated communities, most of which had no idea what had happened at Waterberg or that a revolt had even taken place. Because of this, and because most of the tribes had virtually no military force, the Germans spread across the land with relative ease, killing anyone they could get their hands on. Because most of the troops had recently arrived in German Southwest Africa, they also had difficulty telling apart Herero from other African people, and because of this, many non-Hereros were massacred as well. Some more testimonies read, "On one occasion I saw about 25 prisoners placed in a small enclosure of thorn bushes. They were confined in a very small space, and the soldiers cut dry branches and piled dry logs all around them. Men, women, and children, and little girls were there. When dry branches had been all thickly piled up all around them, the soldiers threw branches also on the top of them. The prisoners were all alive and unwounded, but half-starved. Having piled up the branches, lamp oil was sprinkled on the heap and it was set on fire. The prisoners were burnt to a cinder. I saw this personally. The Germans said, 'We should burn all these dogs and baboons in this fashion.' The officers saw this and made no attempt to prevent it. Some distance beyond Hamakari, we camped at a water hole. While there, a German soldier found a little Herero boy about 9 months old lying in the bush. The child was crying. He brought it into the camp where I was. The soldiers formed a ring and started throwing the child to one another and catching it as if it were a ball. The child was terrified and hurt and was crying very much. After a time they got tired of this, and one of the soldiers fixed his bayonet on the rifle and said he would catch the baby. The child was tossed into the air towards him, and as it fell, he caught it and transfixed the body with the bayonet. The child died in a few minutes, and the incident was greeted with roars of laughter by the Germans, who seemed to think it was a great joke. One day alone, I saw 7 Hereros hanged in a row, and on other days 2s and 3s. The Germans did not worry about rope. They used ordinary fencing wire, and the unfortunate native was hoisted up by the neck and allowed to die of slow strangulation. This was all done in public, and the bodies were always allowed to hang for a day or so as an example to the other natives. Natives who were placed in gaol at that time never came out alive. Many died of sheer starvation and brutal treatment. The Hereros were far more humane in the field than the Germans. They were once a fine race. Now we have only a miserable remnant left. As for the Nama, they were still bound to conscription into the German colonial army, thanks to the treaty they had signed with Leutwein years prior. However, once the news made it back to the Nama chiefs about what the Germans had done at Waterberg, groups rose up in rebellion against Germany. Although the Nama had technically briefly been the allies of the Germans, they were never treated much better than the Herero, with their supposed comrades in the German army repeatedly making racist remarks about them and joking about killing them. In fact, one of German Southwest Africa's most popular newspapers, die Deutsch-Südwestafrikanische Zeitung, openly and explicitly called for the extermination of the Nama, saying that while the Herero were needed for labor, the Nama were insignificant people that they could afford to eradicate. It had quickly become clear to the Nama that once the Germans were done with the Herero, that they would be next, and different groups of Nama began to rebel, the 2 most significant of which were of course Hendrik Witbooi and another Nama leader named Jacob Morenga, both of whom engaged in a campaign of guerrilla warfare against the occupying German forces, taking advantage of their knowledge of the land to launch attacks on German soldiers and raids on German supply houses. Jacob Morenga, who was dubbed Black Napoleon in his time, was a very interesting person, because although Hendrik Witbooi preferred to fight with exclusively Nama people, Morenga fought with anybody who wanted to fight, meaning that his group was made up of Namas, Hereros, other African people from surrounding land, and even a white Australian guy, and in just 1 year, his crew grew from 11 men to over 300. For a brief period, these groups fought together against the Germans, and Morengas, the Witbois, and the remaining Herero were able to put up some sort of resistance. However, the resistance couldn't last forever. In 1905, during a battle, Hendrik Witbooi was shot in the thigh and slowly bled out over the next 3 days. At the age of 75, Hendrik said his last words, "It is enough now, the children shall have peace," before succumbing to his injuries. Worried that Germans would exhume his body, he was buried, along with his Bible, in an unmarked grave. 2 years after that, Jacob Morenga, who had waged over 50 separate attacks on German occupation forces, was also killed in battle. He was only 32. Theodor Leutwein, who was still technically the governor at the time of the Waterberg, only found out about everything that had happened there, as well as the extermination order that followed it, a few weeks after. He tried to accept the surrender of the Herero on behalf of von Trotha, but after it was made clear that this wouldn't work, he resigned his post and left back to Germany. While the genocide was in full force at this time, German politicians were busy debating the optics of the genocide, with some claiming that if the extermination order was to become public knowledge, that it would damage Germany's reputation. One person in the German government who didn't seem to care about this at all, however, was unsurprisingly the Kaiser of Germany himself, Wilhelm II. Weeks after the extermination order had been made known to the German government, Kaiser Wilhelm II sent von Trotha a letter claiming, "You have entirely fulfilled my expectations when I named you commander of the colonial troops, and I take pleasure in expressing once again my utter gratitude for your accomplishments so far." So even if Wilhelm wasn't directly involved in the planning and carrying out of the genocide, he was fully aware that it was taking place in his name and undertook no initiative to stop it. In fact, after members of his government demanded that he rescinded the extermination order for fear of public backlash, the Kaiser stalled for 13 days before responding, during which he decided to go on a 5-day-long hunting trip. After almost 2 weeks of avoiding his chancellors, he agreed that von Trotha should have mercy on the Herero who did surrender. Apparently, upon receiving the Kaiser's orders, von Trotha was so enraged that he couldn't just kill indiscriminately that he tried to resign, although it wasn't accepted. However, after a year of unsuccessful fighting with the Nama, as well as the death of both of his nephew, a soldier in his army, and the death of his wife back in Germany, von Trotha would resign a second time and be granted leave. With Luitwin, the man who made settlements in Southwest Africa safer for settlers, and von Trotha, who had started the genocide against the Nama and Herero people, both gone, a new governor would be sent to rule over German Southwest Africa and to finish the genocide, a man by the name of Friedrich von Lindqvist. At this point, many of the Herero had been massacred indiscriminately or pushed into a desert to starve to death. However, with the extermination order now rescinded, the genocide needed to turn to different methods of killing. Von Trotha was a military general with an unflinching white supremacist view of the world in which he saw Africans and Chinese as subhumans, and because of this, he was able to be completely ruthless in his tactics of extermination. However, for many other colonial theorists, as well as members of the government and the new governor von Lindqvist, colonized people such as the Herero were seen as an economic resource, so instead of killing them, it made more sense, at least in the mind of the German government, to enslave them, at least temporarily. One of the people that helped push this idea to reality was Count Georg von Stillfried, an officer that was personally commissioned by the Kaiser himself to investigate the native question and come up with possible solutions. In his report back to the Kaiser, von Stillfried writes, "All chiefs should be executed, and their families, even if they are innocent, should be deported to another colony so that they will never again gain influence among their people. All natives from warring tribes, apart from those who work for the government, should be leased out either in large or small numbers to private persons, farmers and merchants, and so forth. Here they should perform labor for food. To do this, they would build big settlements where slaves would be held, and soon 5 concentration camps had been built throughout German Southwest Africa. In these camps, Herero and Nama were forced to work from early morning to late at night, 7 days a week, and any mistake or perceived disrespect would result in beatings, if not an outright murder. Missionaries who were present at the camp would write that the Herero who began dying of exhaustion en masse would be driven to death and buried like cattle. They would sleep, thousands shoved into one poorly constructed shack surrounded by barbed wire. When it came to food, rations were limited to 500 grams of rice or flour a day, and with no means of cooking or preparing their rations, many took to eating their rice raw, which would in turn cause dysentery and lead to more deaths. As for the jobs they had to do, there were various. Herero prisoners, men, women, and children alike, were forced to build roads, railways, as well as stock weapons and food that they would never get to use. Herero and Nama were also rented out to German businesses for construction work. They would build homes, docks, and even work in leveling mountains for new structures. For as little as 50 Pfennig a day or 10 Reichsmarks a month, you could rent out an entire person. The people that were rented out to businesses also worked under brutal conditions. One German who had bought 1,600 Nama slaves complained to the camps that the amount of Nama available to work had shrunk to a mere 40 people, with the rest having died or become physically incapable. Women and children were also in high demand, particularly in the settler community, who would save up their money in order to rent out their own personal servant. The most disturbing of the jobs the prisoners would have to do was the dismemberment and cleaning of bones of the dead to be sold to German universities and race scientists. Women and children especially were employed to boil the hands and skulls of their fellow prisoners, some of which were very likely family and friends, to prepare them to be shipped back to Germany. Despite both the Herero and Nama suffering horribly under the same conditions, the attitudes of the German settlers toward these two groups were actually quite different. While the Herero were seen as economically necessary, the Nama and their presence in the camps near the settlements was very hated. The Nama were physically smaller than the Herero and weren't considered to be very good laborers. On top of this, racist perceptions of the Nama being mixed breeds and savages meant that the German settlers wanted nothing to do with them, not even as slaves. To fix this, von Lindqvist would send many of the Nama to a concentration camp on an island near Luderitz, called Shark Island. Shark Island was so feared by the Herero and Nama that there are accounts of people committing suicide just to avoid being sent there, some using just the sheer force of their hand to impale their throats. The fear was not misplaced. Accounts of the camp read, "A woman who was so weak from illness that she could not stand crawled to some of the other prisoners to beg for water. The overseer fired 5 shots at her. 2 shots hit her, 1 in the thigh, the other smashing her forearm. In the night, she died. On one occasion, I saw a woman carrying a child of under a year old slung at her back and with a heavy sack of grain on her hand. The sand was very steep and the sun was baking. She fell down forward on her face, and the heavy sack fell partly across her and partly on the bab. The corporal sjamboked her for certainly more than 4 minutes, and sjamboked the baby as well. She did not utter a sound the whole time, but the baby cried very hard." I had seen a whole series of illustrated postcards depicting wholesale executions and similar gruesome doings to death of these poor natives. One of these, that enjoyed great vogue at the time, showed a line of 10 Hottentots, some still standing on the packing cases with a noose around their necks, waiting for the soldiers to kick their last standing place away, some kicking and writhing in the death struggle, for the short drop did not break their necks, but only strangled them slowly, and one having a German soldier hanging on his legs to finish the work more quickly. What's shocking is how accustomed and normalized these camps were in German settler society, as well as Germany itself. The Shark Island concentration camp was clearly visible from the town of Luderitz, and many of the dead had simply been dumped into the ocean, only to wash up on the shore shortly thereafter. In one of the biggest camps, the one located in Swakopmund, it was estimated that a prisoner would die within 10 months of entering the camp, either from exhaustion, disease, or malnutrition, and this pattern would repeat itself at Shark Island. This would continue for 4 years until 1907, when Major Ludwig von Astorff, who had recently been promoted, ordered the concentration camps to be closed. Some people might hear this and think that von Astorff was a good guy for closing the camps, and sure, while that action was good, von Astorff willingly participated in the Waterberg massacre, served in the colonial army for years, and would later go on to support the Kapp Putsch, a failed coup in the Weimar Republic led by many German nationalists that would soon become Nazis, as well as the people that murdered Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Instead of having the Herero and Nama simply killed en masse, he instead moved them to reservations back in the mainland, where they continued to live in horrible conditions and many more would continue to die, but at least they wouldn't be explicitly worked to death. There was a debate both in Germany and in the German settler communities in Namibia about whether the camps were meant to cause the death of so many people, or if this was just a byproduct of the poor conditions that they lived in. The biggest piece of evidence, however, that the camp's purpose was not labor but to kill those imprisoned in them is the death register at the Swakopmund concentration camp, where next to every identification number and description of a corpse was the column for their cause of death. And on every page this cause of death was already printed into the register: death through exhaustion, bronchitis, heart disease, or scurvy. It is extremely difficult to calculate how many people died throughout this genocide because the majority of the camps either didn't keep any records or destroyed all of them. What is known is that between 5 and 10,000 Nama were sent to concentration camps. By 1909, only 248 survived, with many more Nama being killed elsewhere. As for the Herero, more than 80% of the total population had either been killed or had fled the German colony. Some historians estimate the number of Herero victims as up to 100,000. Germany lost all of its overseas colonies once it had signed the Treaty of Versailles. Before that, German Southwest Africa had been invaded by South African troops with the help of the British during the First World War. There are two pretty big factors, among others, that contributed to the decision made between European powers that Germany was not fit as a country to rule overseas colonies. And while I think it's important to remember that the people making these accusations were themselves doing similar things that they criticized Germany for doing, I wanted to highlight them anyway to paint a better picture of Germany's current standing, and also how other people who lived in the early 1900s wrote and thought about them. The first big thing that really soured opinions on the German military, besides of course the fact that they were currently at war, was a battle that had occurred in 1914 in Belgium, where the German army marched into the town of Louvain and killed 6,000 civilians. The second piece of proof that the Germans were unfit to govern colonies was a document commissioned by the British government called the Blue Book, that documented all the crimes that the Germans had committed in Namibia. After the German colonial forces had surrendered to the South Africans, the soldiers began to explore the colony. It didn't take very long for them to find mass graves in the desert. Upon talking with the locals, they had discovered basically everything. Soldiers wrote in their diaries, "The German farmer and villager are living in constant dread of natives, and if an evil conscience makes people afraid, they have every reason to be so." Ugly rumor has it that most of them were driven to the desert to die of hunger or thirst. Deciding to use this genocide as a political tool, a lawyer by the name of Thomas Leslie O'Reilly was commissioned to write up reports that included every atrocity that he could find. Now, obviously, the British Empire didn't really care about genocide and was also personally directly involved in the spreading of the atrocity propaganda that innocent German settlers had been massacred when the Herero rose up to resist their colonizers. South Africa as well had militarily assisted Germany while they were carrying out the genocide and was the military responsible for killing Yaka Morenga. Nonetheless, these two events were used as an excuse in court, and what was formerly known as German Southwest Africa would now be governed by South Africa. Now, in the words of the South African general that led the original invasion, they wanted to continue the standing of the white race. Some German settlers were deported back to Germany, but many got to continue living on just fine. As for the Herero and Nama, a lot of them were moved around again and forced to settle in small reservations to make space for Afrikaners that were migrating into their new colony. This is how Germany as a state lost their control over Namibia, but the idea of what Namibia represented was never forgotten. It was just adapted into what we all know came next. The German community in Namibia did absolutely everything they could to change the truth of what they had done into a story of heroic resistance against untamable savages. Statues were built in what was just a few years ago a concentration camp where settlers would come and honor the soldiers who died while doing genocide. Massacres were turned into stories of heroic battles that had been won by the German army, such as the massacre at the Ombakaha, where German soldiers told Hereros that they should come out of their hiding spots and surrender, and then mass executed all of them. How what happened at Ombakaha could be described as a battle when literally not a single German soldier was killed or even wounded is beyond me, but this is how the entire history of a planned genocide against a native population was written into a story of moral triumph. Looking to increase the power and economic activity in a colony that had no more outside threat, the German government began offering financial incentives and land for Germans to move there. And many did. In 1904, at the start of the genocide, there were about 5,000 German settlers, and just 9 years later, that number had increased by 10,000. And all these new settlers, they wouldn't interact with the Herero or the Nama like some of the very first settlers had. They would know nothing about this land other than what German history taught them, and for a while at least, the German settlers had a really good life there, if you ignore all the death and misery it was built on. It was exactly this type of life and these types of ideas that would become very attractive to Nazis and earlier fascists before them. Novels and memoirs written by settlers about their experiences in the new German frontier became very popular back in Germany, and this idea was pushed and supported by the Nazis as a way of convincing the public of the necessity of Lebensraum. The laws and agricultural reality was also of big interest to the Nazis. Oskar Hinträger, a deputy governor of German Southwest Africa, had studied the history of the United States development and was fascinated by it, a fascination that Hitler would also come to share. Hitler and other top Nazi scientists and politicians were fascinated by the race laws that had been implemented in the German colony. At this point, Germany, and especially its colonies, had already warmed up to the idea of racial purity and racial hygiene. This would of course create problems for Germany in the forms of mixed-race kids. Germany has a law that states if the father of a parent is a German, then the child itself is also a German. While mainland Germany certainly did have its share of non-ethnic Germans living in it at the time, some of whom got married and had kids, the quote-unquote problem of mixed-race children was amplified while they were occupying Namibia. German racial scientists and politicians at the time began to view mixed-race children from the German colonies as an existential threat, the presence of which could destroy all of German culture. Although the political and military leaders tried to discourage it, soldiers and settlers did engage in both consensual and non-consensual relationships with women that lived there. And there was also the added problem that the German presence in Namibia was very male-dominated for quite a long time, since many of the people that had moved there were either soldiers or miners and other manual laborers. At first, the government tried to dissuade these types of relationships by offering free passage to unmarried German women, hoping that the presence of white women would stop white settlers from being with black women. When this didn't work, however, the government, headed by the aforementioned Oskar Hinträger, began to implement a series of laws, including the dissolution and banning of all marriages between German settlers and Africans, and banning government support to settlers in mixed-race relationships. This was of course generally well received in Germany, and the idea of implementing these laws in Germany itself was also proposed. Germany, which has had a deeply ingrained ongoing anti-Semitism problem for over 100 years now, of course began to mix in Jewish people into the mixed race question. This history of racial purity laws to prevent clean and unclean races of mixing, as well as the experiences of German soldiers on the Eastern Front of the First World War, especially in Poland, the Baltics, and Ukraine, likening it back to Namibia and viewing this land as potential future settlement for Germans, began to form into the political beliefs of the Nazis a few years down the line. Between the end of the Namibian Genocide in 1908 and the beginning of Nazi rule in 1933, quite a few years had passed. But there was one event right between the two that perfectly illustrates both the ideologies and the type of people who were involved in the Namibian Genocide and supported fascism, and that was the German Revolution of 1918. I mentioned in my last video that this is a very long and complicated topic, and I don't want to do it any injustice, so I will again refer you to several other videos that talk about the German Revolution in more detail, but the very basic gist of it is that workers and soldiers had forced the Kaiser to abdicate, making Germany into a republic. The party that took over after that had a lot of internal conflicts with some parts of it, mainly the SPD of today, wanting to reform the government, while others, the communists, wanting to implement a council-based form of government. Regardless, many right-wing nationalists were not happy with what had happened and began to organize to put down the revolution and kill dissenters. These groups were called the Freikorps, and a lot of the people that joined them were veterans of the Namibian Genocide, which was the perfect opportunity for them to teach the other group of people that joined the Freikorps, future Nazis. Ludwig von Macke, who formed the very first Freikorps unit, was a member of the German colonial army and served as an overseer of the Shark Island concentration camp. Hermann Ehrhardt, a colonial naval commander in German-occupied Namibia, formed a unit that would wear the swastika on their helmets and sing a song that would later become the official theme of Hitler's personal bodyguard. Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck was a soldier who had served at the Battle of Waterberg that would also form his own Freikorps unit. Another veteran of the Waterberg that would form his own unit was Franz Javier Ritter von Epp. Now, von Epp got very busy recruiting men to fight for him, including people like Wilhelm Stuckart, a lawyer who helped draft the Nuremberg laws, Gerhard Wagner, Hitler's Commissioner for National Health, where he developed a Jewish sterilization program, Gregor Strasser, the Reichspropaganda leader and the man who brought Joseph Goebbels into the Nazi Party, and Ernst Röhm, a close friend of Hitler and leader of the SA, until he was executed by the Nazis in the party's purge of 1934. The most famous of von Epp's unit, however, was probably Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy Führer. Once the revolution had been stopped, these men got a little taste of their future as they went around killing basically any known communist who had supported the revolution. Later on, both Hermann Ehrhardt and Franz von Epp would directly support Hitler and the Nazi Party, Ehrhardt by unifying his Freikorps into the wider SA, and von Epp by illegally taking money belonging to the German army and donating it to Hitler so that he could buy his own newspaper and create propaganda with it. In fact, the SA uniforms themselves were literally old or extra Schutztruppe uniforms worn by occupying colonial officers. Hitler himself was also influenced by the genocide in Namibia and the theories that came out of it. Both Hitler and earlier colonists were inspired by Friedrich Ratzel and his Lebensraum theory. Hitler was a big believer in social Darwinism, that all of life was a struggle for survival, and that superior races, like the Aryans, were destined to take land and resources from the inferior ones, like Africans or Slavs. Both of these theories were used to justify the genocide against Namibians, and were also further developed in their process of the genocide. Racial scientists came up with tests on African skulls to prove that they were inferior, and studies were conducted on mixed-race children to prove that mixing races degenerates and dirties a bloodline. With all of the tests and experiences of the settlers taken as proof, books like Human Hereditary and Racial Hygiene could be published, a book that Hitler read many times, and one that one of its own authors, Fritz Lenz, claims inspired his worldview. I know that I've talked a lot in this section, and that it was a bit unorganized, so I want to recap several of the influences that German colonialism had on Nazi ideology. 1. Core beliefs and theories about Lebensraum and racial superiority that laid the foundation of their worldview were shared and developed simultaneously. 2. People who were a part of the Namibian Genocide supporting and taking part in the Nazi Party. The Nazis knew this themselves and played into it heavily, with memoirs of settlers and the adventure books on colonial frontiers from authors such as Karl May, who Hitler was a big fan of, being pushed onto the German audience to convince them of the party's necessity. In fact, in the official party biographies of Nazi Party member Hermann Göring, the text mentions his father, Heinrich Göring, the very first colonial deputy of German Southwest Africa, and tries to make a connection between his bravery in Namibia and Hermann's worldview, rather than the truth, which was that Heinrich accidentally built over some graves and went immediately running back to Germany for fear of his life. 3. Laws regarding race mixing were adopted into the legal framework of Nazi Germany. This time, however, the laws would have affected Jewish people rather than African people. The penalty affecting Germans who were in relationships with Jewish people, such as the denial of tax benefits, were also carried over. In 1941, Oskar Hintreger, the deputy who drafted the original laws in German Southwest Africa, wrote about the dangers of racial mixing. What Germany had implemented in its colony was an early example of racial apartheid, a crime against humanity which South Africa would later adopt into its own legal system while further developing it, and a crime that the settler colony state of Israel is implementing right now with the full support of the German state. 4. The use of concentration camps as a way of conducting a genocide is also a glaring similarity. Nazi Germany's use of concentration camps, especially the death camp at Auschwitz, is probably the most well-known use of concentration camps in history, and for good reason. So it should be more well known that the same country had used the exact same methods 40 years earlier in Namibia. More than just the way they were killed, why the victims of both these genocides were killed is also extremely similar, with both of its perpetrators believing them to be inferior races who just happened to be in the way. The Nazis weren't just inspired by German colonialism, of course, but European colonialism as a whole. The entire time he was in Nuremberg prison, until he committed suicide, Hermann Göring insisted that Germany was just like France, Britain, and the United States. Hitler himself gushes over his inspirations when he says things like, Germany needed to learn from the English, who, with 250,000 men, govern 400 million Indians. What India is for England, the territories of Russia will be for us. The Herero and Nama genocide would go unrecognized by Germany until 2015, although the wording around the acknowledgement is also very weird. They say that from today's standpoint it would be called genocide, and they felt so strongly about this that it was brought to court in 2017, it wasn't technically genocide because the Genocide Convention didn't exist yet. Ignoring the fact that by the very same criteria the Holocaust also technically wasn't a genocide, whether those actions constitutes historical acknowledgement in committing genocide is up to you, although virtually every single European news outlet accepted this as enough. In 2018, the remains of all the Herero skeletons that Germans took were finally returned to Namibia. In 2021, Germany agreed to donate 1.1 billion euros to various organizations over a period of 30 years. Regardless, throwing money at something isn't the way to deal with a problem, especially if that problem is the ongoing effects of genocide, even if Germany desperately wants it to be. The declaration that came with the money even said, Germany asks for forgiveness for the sins of their forefathers. But instead of what is effectively paying for genocide, Germany, if they were even a little bit honest about wanting to do anything about the genocide besides saving face, would maybe talk with the people that were actually affected by it. People in Namibia were not happy with the deal, especially because it was a deal Germany made directly with the Namibian government, which didn't include any Herero or Nama groups present during the discussion. And it's not for lack of trying. These groups are very vocal about what they want Germany to do. Activists from affected communities like Peringanda, a Herero man whose family was affected by the genocide, have asked Germany to buy land occupied by German settlers and redistribute it back to the Hereros it belonged to. Peringanda says that he knows the family that today lives on the land that was taken from his family. He has tried to appeal to both the Namibian and German government for reparations and for his family to be able to live on the land that belonged to them, but because the German family that lives there legally bought the land from the people that stole it from him, nothing has been done. A document about the colonial repercussions in Namibia put out by the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights elaborates on this process of legal theft. German jurisprudence in the late 19th and beginning of the 20th century contributed to the invisibilization of existing legal structures and standards in the region that is Namibia today. The European concept of individual property was introduced without recognizing that it was replacing an existing system that organized the use of land. A dual system of colonial laws was installed, which justified racial segregation. And because we still exist in a system that refuses to accept that people all around the world used to live in societies completely different to that of the European one that revolves around private property, these previous systems are still ignored, which is how people can justify buying land from someone who stole it as being the rightful owner of that land, despite other people having lived and worked on it for generations. Today, Namibia continues to suffer economically. Despite being classified as a middle-income country, the rate of wealth inequality is one of the highest in the world. Nearly 30% of the population is unemployed or living in poverty. Access to education and doctors is also a big problem in Namibia, because even though it's a big country, it's populated at around 2.8 people per square kilometer, making it difficult to access people in rural areas, another effect of having a massive part of your population exterminated. Another big factor that plays into the massive wealth inequality is the land distribution. In the most recent publication of the Namibian Statistics Agency regarding land ownership, the document doesn't refer to race at all, but we can still clearly find out who owns what. The document states that 97% of commercial farmland is owned by Namibians, with 14% owned by the government and the remaining 86% owned by Namibian citizens. Although it may sound like this is actually a really good ratio, the document continues. Previously advantaged Namibians own 27.8 million hectares, or 70% of the freehold agricultural land, while previously disadvantaged Namibians own only 6.4 million hectares, or 16%. What does previously advantaged and previously disadvantaged Namibians refer to? White people and black people who were affected differently under the apartheid laws implemented by South Africa. For a country whose population is between 4 and 7% white, and whose remaining 3% of land owned by foreign nationals mostly consists of Germans and South African citizens, we can clearly tell that the white population in Namibia, the vast majority of which can only trace their family's history in Namibia back to, at most, about 120 years, to people who were either active participants in genociding the indigenous population or moving into the homes they were kicked out of, it's clear that this tiny part of the population is still massively profiting off of the displacement and genocide brought on by their ancestors. And this helps Germany out too. When Germans in Namibia wanted to trade, what's one of the first countries they went to? Shortly after the genocide had ended, German settlers discovered diamonds. In which countries do you think that money ended up in? Because the money certainly didn't go to the Herero or Nama people who actually mined them. Only the Germans who owned the land and the Germans who owned the businesses got that profit. In fact, German companies such as Deutsche Bank and Krupp Steel, both companies that supported the rise of Adolf Hitler just a few decades later, helped organize and pay for the transport of Germans to German Southwest Africa because their work and their ownership of property would be beneficial to them as well. Even today, most Namibians work in agriculture and farming, but most of those farms are owned by white people, meaning the majority of the profits of their work is going straight into the hands of that 4 to 7%. Every year, over 100,000 German tourists visit Namibia, where they stay at, eat at, and go on tours with white-owned businesses. The economic relationship between Germany and Namibia is one defined by an almost complete avoidance of legal responsibility. It's nice that Germany can at least bring themselves to say that what they did was like a genocide but not technically a genocide, but even when they're giving Namibia money, they just can't bring themselves to say these are reparations. Doing so would set a legal precedent, and Germany just cannot admit it did anything legally wrong. In the previous ECCHR document that I cited, an attorney writes, "Unsurprisingly, Germany has taken the position that it bears no legal responsibility for the first genocide of the 20th century, only a moral and political one. Germany argues that the genocides and expropriations were inner dealings in its own territory, and not governed by international law, that the Herero and Nama were imperial subjects to whom it could do anything it wished, and that international human rights did not protect savages. Thus, the German government does not try to deny the genocides, it tries to justify them. No rights were infringed, argues the German government, because the Herero and Nama had no rights to not be exterminated. What value could any future hypothetical apology ever have if Germany argues in court that its treatment of unarmed Herero and Nama civilians at Waterberg and beyond was fully justified? If the German government argues that it was entirely justified in trying to exterminate the Herero and Nama, then does it not follow as a logical corollary that it was equally justified in deciding to treat the men, women, and children at Auschwitz-Birkenau in the manner it did? It is logically inconsistent and legally and morally repugnant for the German government to take the untenable position that it was entitled to kill and take the human remains of as many Herero and Nama men, women, and children as it wished, while at the same time accepting both legal and moral responsibility for the extermination of some 6 million Jews. Germany's attempt to justify the 1904 to 1908 Herero and Nama genocides is an offense not only to the memory of the victims, survivors, and their children, but also to the memory of those targeted for extermination in the Holocaust. Every German either knows or should know that the Herero and Nama genocides, like the Holocaust, were a violation not only of morality and politics, but also of law. Germany's position that the money given to Namibia was not legal reparations for carrying out a genocide, but a gesture of goodwill so that they could buy the forgiveness of the Namibian government but not its people, is also a part of how the Herero and Nama genocide is dealt with socially within Germany too. The author of the previous quote brings up an interesting comparison, that of the Holocaust. Germany has no problems paying reparations to Jewish people and other groups affected by the Holocaust and openly proclaiming it to be reparations. But the way that the Holocaust and the Herero and Nama genocide is dealt with socially in Germany is also completely different. Not only is it telling that Germany refuses to refer to its payments towards the Namibian government as reparations while proudly announcing all of their reparations towards the victims of the Holocaust and the settler colonial state of Israel, but this policy of willful ignorance carries over into the German education system, as well as the way the genocide is remembered, or I guess it's better to say ignored socially as well. Obviously, the Second World War and the Holocaust is a compulsory part of German education, as it should be. But Germany's colonial history is a subject that can be focused on or skipped depending on the individual teacher. A German history teacher with Ghanaian roots started a petition recently to make colonial history a compulsory subject, and said in an interview, "Most of those who criticize it are teachers. They accuse us of overlooking the fact that colonial history is already part of the curriculum. But the problem is that the topic is not compulsory. In addition to this, the fact that a topic is not compulsory means that it isn't strictly regulated in the same way World War II education is, for example. You can get a teacher who decides to spend a significant amount of time understanding the genocide, colonialism, its ongoing effects, and importantly, how the same belief system led to the Holocaust, or you can get someone like Björn Höcke, one of the leaders of the far-right ultranationalist Alternative for Germany party and former history teacher. Honestly, it doesn't even need to be someone as bad as Björn Höcke, because a person who grew up in the German education system themselves wouldn't have any background knowledge to know that they would have to teach this in relation to the Holocaust, in relation to Germany's relationship with Namibia today, because they were never taught about it in the first place. It just kind of creates an never-ending loop. Obviously, this approach doesn't lead to a society with the same understanding of history and their country's development. For an event whose causes are so deeply linked with the Holocaust, this is especially troubling. Although the memory of what Germans did in the Second World War is still talked about, the trend in recent years has been shifting towards people wanting to be done with it, believing they've made up for it. If that's true of the Holocaust, it's even more true for the Namibian Genocide. It's just like the ECCHR report said earlier, this is paying to justify a genocide. I'm including this here as like a little aside because I thought it was such a stupid thing that I read that I needed to share it, but while doing research on how German colonial history is taught in public schools, because there's so little research written about it, I was linked to a Reddit post on the r/Namibia page where someone pointed this out. Among the answers, I found a German who claims a Nama woman told him that they actually didn't want to be paid reparations, someone claiming that the Romans oppressed their family 1800 years ago, so he wants reparations too, and someone saying that actually the money donated to the Namibian government is proportional to the amount of victims, which isn't true, but whatever. But what I want to focus on is the most upvoted comment under this post, by a person linking to a bunch of ways that Germany is helping Namibia's economy grow. Now, I already talked about how the wealth inequality in Namibia is some of the worst in the entire world, so clearly helping the economy grow hasn't materially affected the poorest people in Namibia. But the commentator did mention that Germany helped build Namibia's electrical grid, which I wasn't aware of at the time, so I decided to do a bit more research. And guess what I found? The money given to the Namibian government by the Germans was used to build a more renewable energy plant in the region of Namibia home to Swakopmund and Walvis Bay. Literally some of the first German settlements and some of the only regions in Namibia where white people are a majority. Even more, this wasn't providing energy to people who didn't have access to it, but replacing an already existing coal-fired power plant with a more renewable energy source. Considering that around 70 to 80% of rural households in Namibia don't have access to electricity to this day, and that most white Namibians live in urban centers exactly like Swakopmund and Walvis Bay, this donation from Germany has had virtually no effect on the majority of the actual lives of the descendants of the Nama and Herero genocide, as well as most other black Namibians affected by racial segregation laws. What Germany has done here is effectively build a better energy plant for the people who work and live in the country's most economically profitable cities. I know that this is an individual who made this comment, but I truly think it signifies how most Germans and Europeans think about reparations and historical accountability, that a monetary transaction is the same as taking responsibility, and that throwing money at a wall is the same as doing the work to help rebuild a society that you destroyed. This is exactly the type of perspective you would have if you've received no education on colonialism and its effects, not to mention the Namibian Genocide and the German occupation itself. The way the perpetrators of the Namibian Genocide are remembered is also quite telling. Obviously, the perpetrators of the Holocaust are not given memorials or have streets named after them to remember them by. The same courtesy is not afforded to Theodor Luitwin, one of the colonial officers directly involved with the building up of colonies and preparation of the genocide, who has several streets named after him in Germany. Adolf Lüderitz, the man responsible for the very first German settlement in Namibia, also has streets named after him. Gustav Nachtigall, an explorer who contributed to the colonization of Togoland and Cameroon, also has streets named after him. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the man who could have stopped the genocide at any moment, has a statue of him in Köln. Even Lothar von Trotha, one of the people with the most personal responsibility in the entire genocide, had a street in Munich named after him until it was changed in 2006. That's okay though, because in Essen there's still a street named after him. Could you imagine if Nazi officers today had streets named after them? There is no Joseph Goebbels Straße, there is no Rudolf Hess Platz. You can't find these things because fundamentally the Holocaust is treated with the severity that it deserves, and the genocide in Namibia is one that the German public would like to in large part forget. Obviously, a large part of this is the lack of education, and more importantly, the lack of interest in education about Germany's colonial history, but a lot of this has to do with just general racism in German society. The Holocaust is taught as a uniquely terrible thing that happened, that the Germans did the worst thing that could ever be done. To be clear, they did. But they didn't do it once, they did it twice. And so did a lot of other countries around the world. It's not a surprise at all that countries like Germany, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom don't make the connection between the Holocaust and colonialism, because not only doing so would shed light on the fact that they all share a very similar history, but would also further humanize non-white victims of colonial violence. Namibiana.de, a German-run tourist website for vacations in Africa, still refers to Nama people as Hottentots, which is a Dutch racial slur used specifically to emphasize the savagery of certain African people, and was the term used almost exclusively back during the German colonial period to refer to Namas. Actually, if you look at tourism in Namibia as a whole, it seems like the most visited places in Namibia, besides the deserts and the beaches, are Windhoek, Swakopmund, and Walvis Bay, all of which have been historically white settlements during the colonial period, and still have a disproportionately white population when compared to the rest of Namibia. And if you look at the nationality of tourists visiting Namibia every year, you'll find that the very first nationality of tourists in Namibia that aren't countries directly bordering it is Germany. And nothing I've said about Germany's attitude towards the Namibian genocide is better emphasized by the fact that up until 2007, tourists would rent dune buggies to play with over one of the mass graves of Herero people who were murdered in concentration camps. Today, a little memorial has been built around the graves. In front of it, a row of expensive vacation villas. In 2023, the very first movie that dealt with the Herero genocide was released, called Measures of Men, directed by German director Lars Kraum. The film follows a phrenologist who travels to Namibia during the genocide in order to find a Herero woman he had encountered while she was visiting the aforementioned human zoo in Berlin. The Herero people are not really shown on screen. They appear as Herero in the first 20 minutes and then are nothing but victims for the remaining hour. The Nama are only mentioned but never shown. When asked why the decision was made for the film to follow the perspective of the perpetrators of genocide and not its victims, Lars responded by saying as a German it wasn't his place to tell the victim's story. I actually commend this position taken by the film's director, but I'm troubled by the film itself. In an interview, Lars mentions the film's protagonist and his journey throughout the film by saying he starts as naive and innocent and gradually becomes morally reprehensible. I think part of the reason the film didn't completely work for me is because it's framed to be a kind of fall from grace story, when, in all honesty, the character began the movie already as a deeply repulsive person. To frame a race scientist as an innocent person is, I think, indicative of a larger problem that Europeans, but especially Germans, have with who is guilty and responsible of what crime. The character in the movie doesn't commit acts of violence throughout, he is simply present during the genocide. There are moments where he tries to push back, but when this never amounts to anything, he just stops. What constitutes his so-called fall from grace isn't anything he actually does. It's that he's present during the genocide and does nothing to stop it. By the end of the movie, we jump forward a few years, and we see him not as a student of phrenology, but a professor of it. Considering he was a teacher's assistant in the first scene, I don't think the protagonist in the beginning of the movie and the more morally reprehensible version of him at the end have different life goals in mind. I don't think the protagonist becomes morally reprehensible by the end of the movie. I think he starts the movie as morally reprehensible and ends the movie maybe a little less naive of his place in the world. But students of phrenology and people who live their entire lives in Berlin and never once actually stepped foot in Namibia can also be responsible for the genocide, even if they are unaware of it. This is part of a larger idea that seeks to deny the entirety of the genocide by placing the blame on certain individuals. In this case, Lothar von Trotha. Von Trotha is certainly guilty of committing genocide, but not by himself. Despite this, some historians and writers frame him as being almost singularly responsible for the genocide, and ignore the settler colonial government in Namibia supporting him, the settlers themselves, the phrenologists, and most importantly, the state. The same idea has been carried over to several other cases, like the Holocaust for example, where heads of states were punished for their complicity while literally thousands of other soldiers, generals, journalists, professors, police officers, diplomats, and yes, scientists, guilty of the same crime were let off the hook. Blaming the genocide on the actions of one crazed general, that is, if you even accept it to be a genocide, has also become the norm in the German population of Namibia, some of which refer to the genocide still as a war that the Herero and Nama simply lost. In 2009, a German Namibian newspaper published a letter that complained about a recently erected memorial commemorating the murdered Herero because it referred to the concentration camps as concentration camps, despite this being what von Trotha himself referred to them as. Up until the 90s, Germans celebrated Hitler's birthday by flying the swastika flag on their farms. After the suicide of Rudolf Hess, the same newspaper published an article calling him the last representative of a better Germany. Namibia today continues to exist as a deeply broken society where the rich white descendants of both German and South African settlers live in a world unimaginable to the Herero, Nama, and other African people who live on the other side of an impenetrable wall sustained by a history of violence and apartheid. The Federal Republic of Germany, which tries to masquerade its neo-colonial identity behind liberal values and a willingness to be forgiven for its past sins, isn't just complicit in this reality constructed by its forefathers, but actively profits from the mostly German-owned economic base that exists in Namibia today. It claims to be making reparations, but funnels money into projects like renewable energy for wealthy Namibians, while the majority of those affected by colonial violence see none of its effects, and then uses this exact action as a shield of virtue. It wants to come to terms with its past, but refuses to teach it in any way that would mean critical thinking of its own history, further than the 12 years of bird shit over an otherwise glorious history, as a recent German politician put it. I related earlier the German news coverage of the Herero revolt in 1904 to the revolt that occurred in occupied Palestine 120 years later. If the German population was educated about how exactly feelings were manipulated to manufacture consent for genocide then, maybe they wouldn't be so easily susceptible to the same strategy now. More importantly, if Germans could actually empathize with their former victims and saw all the reasons why the Herero decided to revolt violently, I can guarantee you the public perception of Israel would not be the same as it is today. All of this is a part of Germany's flawed understanding of the Holocaust that feeds into the many right-wing and reactionary elements of German society that have made this country what it is today, a country that is right now complicit in another genocide. If you're still here, thank you so much for sticking around to the very end of the video. It ended up being so much longer than I expected. I was originally going to include a part about Germany's complicity in the Armenian genocide as well, which, yes, if you can believe it, they were complicit in 2 genocides before the Holocaust, but the video is long enough as it is, so that will maybe be its own video in the future. I wanted to specifically shout out the books The Kaiser's Genocide by David Olusoga and Casper W. Erichsen, Let Us Die Fighting by Horst Drechsler, and Chapter 3 of the book Genocide, War Crimes and the West, History and Complicity by Jan Bart Gewalt. all of which were used as sources for the majority of the video. Especially the Kaiser's Genocide book, which I read twice while making this video, was a massive help. There was so much information I thought I'd have to research separately, only to find it somewhere already in the book. I really enjoy making these longer history and political documentaries, but they obviously take a lot more time and effort than my other videos and also get less attention. So if you like this video, please give it a like and share it around, and maybe even check out some of my other history videos. I'll focus on some shorter media analysis for now, but don't worry. I'll try to make at least one more of these types of videos before the year is over. I'm also considering starting a Patreon because my videos aren't really advertiser friendly and I'd really like to spend more time researching and making them, so let me know what you think. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.